Okay, so good afternoon everyone. My name's Rex Martin and I'm a PhD student at Monash University. Today I'm going to be discussing some earlier research I conducted into an island microgrid in Scotland. So it's a bit of a different tack to perhaps what you've heard from some of the other speakers. But what's interesting about this island is that the vast majority of the electricity is derived from renewable sources. So in the first half of the presentation, I'll outline some findings that suggest consumers already combine traditional energy data tools, such as energy monitors, with what I'm going to call sensory data. And sensory data simply refers to what people can see, hear, and touch. No more complicated than that. In the second half of the presentation, I'll briefly explore why it might be useful to include sensory data in discussions around energy and behind-the-meter services, particularly for grids with high levels of renewable generation. So I'll begin by briefly outlining the context of my research and explaining why we might want to pay attention to a seemingly unremarkable island on the other side of the globe. So the roughly 100 residents of the Isle of Eigg in Scotland's northwest are serviced by a microgrid known as Eigg Electric, and Eigg Electric draws on hydro, wind and solar generation alongside batteries with diesel generators as backup. And Eigg Electric isn't connected to the mainland grid. Now, I think the first reason we should pay attention to what's happening on Eigg is the high level of renewable generation. Roughly 90% of the island's electricity comes from renewable sources. A second reason to look at Eigg is the established nature of the grid, which was switched on in 2008, and it's also quite innovative. It's thought to be the first grid in the world to combine hydro, wind, and solar with battery storage. A final reason I think we should look at Eigg is that Eigg exists in the real world. It's a case study that gives us an insight into the way real people have lived based on renewable generation. And so for these reasons, I think Eigg might offer us some useful insights into how other grids, and particularly those based on renewables, might function. So now what I'm going to do is briefly outline two findings from the research I conducted on Eigg. And in my research, I sought to find out what people understood about renewable energy, about energy consumption in their own homes, and basically if consumers would alter their energy use if, for example, the sun wasn't shining. Now, as you can imagine, in Scotland that was often the case, but for an Australian context it perhaps makes more sense. And I spent about 5 weeks on Eigg and ended up talking to roughly half of the households on the island. So it's a real experience, as you can imagine. Now, the first finding I want to share relates to energy generation. And in short, what I found was that islanders would engage in a variety of energy-saving measures when they judged renewable generation to be low. But the important thing for us is how islanders judged the level of renewable generation. Now, the primary data-driven means of understanding generation on Eigg was a traffic light system installed above Eigg's only shop, and you can see it just above the door in this photograph here. And this traffic light essentially worked on electrical frequency, and so it would shine green if if generation was higher than consumption, and it would go to red if consumption was higher than generation. So it relates a little bit to what Dean was talking about before in his home. But interestingly, when I was talking to people on Eigg and they were explaining the effects of weather on energy generation, islanders seldom, if ever, reference these traffic lights, and neither did they mention other quantitative tools such as weather forecasts or measuring equipment like rain gauges. Instead, islanders relied on everyday experience and observation to understand how the weather was impacting Eigg Electric. So, for example, islanders made reference to hearing water in nearby creeks and knowing that the hydro would be working, or conversely, hearing that the diesel generators were running and so knowing that renewable generation was low. A farmer, for example, explained, and I'm not going to attempt a Scottish accent, but I will quote, he said, "I know just by looking, crossing burns, which are small creeks, crossing these burns and what have you, how much water's in them. So that'll reflect on what's happening in the big turbine or in the smaller turbines." So the first point I want to make is that the majority of people I spoke with, including consumers with both a very limited technical knowledge and a limited interest in energy, were able to combine local knowledge with what I call sensory data, what they heard, saw and felt, and they used this to understand the day-to-day impact of weather on the generation of renewable energy. A second finding from the research regards consumers' understandings of energy consumption, essentially what appliances and devices used in their house. Now, each household on Eigg was provided with an energy monitor, and this was designed to help both reduce their overall energy use and to help island households remain below a 5 kilowatt cap on domestic consumption. Now, if exceeded this 5 kilowatt cap, which is roughly equivalent to putting a toaster and a kettle on at the same time, it would temporarily switch off your power. So the idea of this 5 kilowatt cap was to make sure that total island energy consumption remained within the safe limits of the system. Now, as I say, these islanders were provided with an energy monitor, which amongst other features displayed real-time energy consumption. Yet, despite an obvious need to conserve energy in a renewable-based system, as well as, I think, a rather ominous threat of having one's power disconnected as a result of overwork in the kettle, only 3 of the households I interviewed regularly use this energy monitor, and in each case for highly idiosyncratic reasons. So essentially, what I found was that the monitors enabled islanders to develop a baseline of knowledge, such as how much energy was required to use the kettle. This understanding was then combined with sensory data, namely what people could feel, as islanders figured out quite quickly that any device or appliance which produced heat was a high energy user. So, rather than compulsively check the energy monitor each and every time something was switched on, islanders instead took a mental note of which sort of hot or warm items were running and simply staggered their use. So this method was not only effective, but I think it was also quite helpful for those islanders lacking a basic understanding of energy units. So, to conclude my findings from Eigg, I'd say that energy consumers already combine traditional and quantified forms of energy data, such as those provided by monitors, with what we might think of as sensory data, what people can see, hear, and feel. Now, I want to conclude by briefly outlining 2 reasons we might include sensory data in our broader discussions of energy and data provision. First, as I say, sensory data is already being used by consumers to understand energy, and even if only subconsciously. Now, I think this is evident not only from my research on Eigg, but if we all consider perhaps our own lives and our own household energy use. So each of us will use our eyes to judge if the weather's good and it's going to be great for solar generation, or perhaps appropriate to hang out the washing, or if you come home and you notice it's brisk in the house and you either want to put on a jumper or turn up the heating. So these things are already being used, and I think accepting the existence and use of sensory data by energy consumers may ultimately help us to harness it for benefit in future. The second point I'd like to make is that sensory data is both intuitive and accessible, because obviously it's through the senses that all of us already engage with and sort of understand the world. So by harnessing sensory data, I think we might be able to engage energy consumers who are either less capable of or perhaps less interested in using technical forms of data provision. So I think to sum up my presentation in something that's hopefully memorable, I'd say that when it comes to data and empowering consumers, which is the theme for us today, I'm not arguing that traditional data provision is completely wrong, but rather that we could benefit from incorporating sensory data. Simply put, sensory data makes sense. Thank you.